cardiovascular system is the first major system to function in the embryo. Before the establishment of a cardiovascular system, the embryo gets the nutrition by diffusion alone. In the middle of the third week, the embryo can't get enough nutrition and oxygen by diffusion alone. Thus, the cardiovascular system appears in the middle of the third week. Actually, earlier at the third week, blood islands appear in the extra-embryonic mesoderm of the yolk sac, connecting stalk, and colon. Some mesenchymal cells become flattened and form endothelial cells, isolating some cell clusters and forming blood islands. These cell clusters develop into hemocytoblasts. The hemocytoblasts in the center of the blood island form hemopoietic stem cells, the precursors of all blood cells. Vessels extend into adjacent areas by endothelial budding to form networks of the endothelial channels. The formation of blood vessels in the embryo occurs first in various parts of the embryonic mesenchyme, in a similar way as extra-embryonic mesoderm. When the extra-embryonic and intra-embryonic networks of the endothelial channels communicate with each other, the primitive cardiovascular system establishes. Actually, at the end of the fourth week, blood circulation begins. In the mesoderm rostral to the oropharyngeal membrane, the islands unite and form a horseshoe-shaped endothelial-lined tube. This region is known as cardiogenic area. The intraembryonic cavity of it develops into pericardial cavity. Paired longitudinal endothelial-lined channels are heart tubes. They develop during the third week. As the head folding occurs, the heart tube and the pericardial cavity move ventrally and caudally and come to lie ventral to the foregut and caudal to the oropharyngeal membrane. As the lateral folding occurs, two endocardial tubes approach each other and fuse to form a single endothelial tube. Similarly, pericardial cavities also fuse to form one pericardial cavity. The heart tube is suspended from the dorsal wall of the pleural cavity by a mesentery. This is dorsal mesocardium. But the central part of this mesentery soon degenerates, forming a communication between the right and the left sides of the pericardial cavity. This communication is the transverse pericardial sinus. During the 21st day, two heart tubes begin to fuse intermittently. During the 22nd day, two heart tubes fuse completely, forming one tubular heart. We can identify three dilations: bulbous cordis, primitive ventricle, primitive atrium. Between the primitive ventricle and the primitive atrium is atrioventricular canal, and the primitive atrium connects with the sinus venosus. The bulbous cordis and the primitive ventricle grow faster than other regions. U-shaped bending occurs between the bulbous cordis and the primitive ventricle. The cephalic portion of the heart tube bends ventrally, caudally, and slightly to the right. The primitive ventricle bends dorsally, cranially, and slightly to the left. Later, bulbous cordis gives rise to the smooth parts of the left and right ventricles, and the primitive ventricle gives rise to trabeculated part of the left and right ventricles. Subsequently, the primitive atrium gets out of the septum transversum and bends dorsally, cranially, creating an S-shaped cardiac loop. Because there is bulbous cordis in the front and there is the esophagus behind it, the primitive atrium bulges bilaterally. This animation shows the bending of the heart tube. During the 30th day, the fetal heart already has the prototype of the adult heart. But there is only one chamber inside the heart. It's still a tubular heart. Well, this is the formation of the heart tube. Now have a quiz. The cornus arteriosus is derived from which of the following? Please make your choice. Thanks for listening. See you next time.